Hi there, and welcome to Considering Comic Books. This week we're going to be talking to a man who has had a massive impact on my life. You could say he's one of the main reasons, one of the main writers who drew me into comics, and that is Mr. Patrick Mills. Patrick, for anyone who's new to comics or new to the channel, just a quick history. Patrick, he started his career as a sub-editor for DC Thompson and Co. He would later go on to work with Jerry Finley Day in Battle Picture Weekly, where they created what is probably regarded as one of the greatest war stories ever written for the level of nuance and also the really an anti-war sentiment, because it looked at the everyday soldier and how it affected him. And that was with his story Charlie's War, drawn by Joe Colquhoun. After that, Pat launched Battle. It was a New Boys title. Later, Action. Again, these would revolutionize the sort of the field of war comics. They massively popular, and they told stories from what I can only really describe as a working class perspective, anti-authoritarian. The big milestone, I guess, in British comics was 2000 AD in 1977, which Pat launched, and it really has changed comics. There was a documentary recently called Future Shock. It basically outlines the history of 2000 AD and how deeply it impacted the American comics industry. This little magazine that had come out in Britain, it was revolutionary. And so from 2000 AD, Pat's continued to make really interesting stuff. Crisis, Star-Lord, Toxic in 1991. He recently had one of his properties, Accident Man, made into a film starring Scott Adkins, I believe. And Pat continues to write some really interesting, relevant, and dare I say it, political stuff in a time where politics in comics is a controversial subject matter again. So, Pat, it's great to have you on the show.
Hey, it's good to be there. Yeah, hi, Mark.
Hi, how you doing, mate? And straight off, one of the things that interests me about your career is, I'd mentioned it in the opening monologue, comic books at the minute, it's become controversial to be political again, and politics, certainly from your perspective, seems to have been something that's integral to the story. It's integral to the comics.
Yeah, well, I think all comics are ultimately political. If you look at Marvel and DC mainstream comics, they're political. They're political in the sense that they're reinforcing the status quo. They're establishment heroes, they're promoting establishment values and so forth. And even if you were to go way, way back before my era, if you go back to the beginning of the Bash Street Kids, where Leo Baxendale told me that the first Bash Street Kids story involved the kids stealing a tank and attacking a police station with it, which I have to say, I reel from shock with the idea of that. And doubtless there'll be collectors out there who go, no, that isn't actually correct, but or it's something like that. But certainly that's what Leo told me. And comics are subversive, or rather, certainly not Marvel and DC. I mean, they're paragons of establishment virtue. But what should we say? British comics and Mad Magazine and many other comics from the States, 1984, Weird and Eerie, and so forth. Comics are meant to be subversive. I mean, apart from these hideous superheroes, but
that's something.
So that's my background, if you like. In other words, I didn't think when I sort of entered the arena that I was really doing anything that different to what had been done before.
I know this is interesting because I know that you've written martial law, and it's a tremendous satire. It's something I've enjoyed. I've got a lot of love for martial law, and Kevin O'Neill's artwork on it. It's just a fantastic comic, and it parodied a lot of the superheroes, and you had sort of variations on the Avengers or Batman or whatever. But do you feel that superheroes have any sort of redeeming features, or do you think they're really just establishment shills? I guess they're pushing that American sort of imperialistic message.
I think you summed them up really well. Better than I could, I think. There are doubtless some around the edges that are different, but if we're talking mainstream and mass circulation, that's what they stand for. And and I suppose you could say that publishing in general over the last 30 years or so has become increasingly conservative. So inevitably that's going to impact on comics too. 2000 AD still has an edge, it still has integrity, but I think it's a little bit swimming against the tide, I have to say. If you look at publishing in general, if you were to go back to the 1970s and 1980s, there were New English Library books which had many anti-authority figures. It was quite normal to do that. Today, all those kind of books have gone, and the readership as well. And the publishers generally, I think, now act as gatekeepers. In other words, they're going to keep out anything that's subversive, political, controversial. There'll always be the odd exception, but that with broad brushstrokes, that's what's going on, and it's going to impact on comics too. So the public at large is being brainwashed with an establishment perspective. I could give you a specific example of that rather than just generalizing. If you take Charlie's War, which is about World War I, and it's a very strong anti-war story, that couldn't be published today. And if you look at its counterparts on television, they have been barely seen during the centenary years. Blackadder Goes Forth, I think, was not shown on terrestrial TV. Monocle Mutineer might have been shown at just very recently, but certainly not in the early years of the centenary. Oh, What a Lovely War was sneered at by Michael Gove, who said, this is just the sort of Vietnam hippie generation. Not so. The original stage production came back, and I went along to see it, and it was the audience was solid, and they were mainly, I'd say, mainly young people who were at the theatre with Oh, What a Lovely War. But all these things have been pretty much pushed out, and funnily enough, I'm just writing an article about Charlie's War, so it's fresh in my mind that all the books that are out at the moment are all revisionist books, telling us that General Haig is this wonderful hero of World War I, which is very different to past generations where he was pretty much condemned for what he was, which was a butcher. And today, I'm just going through them. 2011, the Chief, Douglas Haig and the British Army, Gary Sheffield, who's Sandhurst. Douglas Haig from the Somme to Victory, 2009, Gary Sheffield. Field Marshal Earl Haig, Philip Warner, 2014. Architect of Victory, Douglas Haig, Walter Reed, 2011. The Good Soldier, Douglas Haig, Gary Mead, 2014. Haig, A Reappraisal, Brian Bond, 2009. Now, this isn't coincidence, and you might say, well, okay, it's the centenary, so why wouldn't there be these books out on?
Yeah.
And that's a fair point, but it's just Haig that they're focusing on. And, I mean, how many books do we really want to read about this butcher? You know, it's just endless books, and the answer is they're going to keep on pumping them out until it becomes the new Orwellian reality. You know, until we actually believe that that is the case, and you know, it's remarkably sad. So Charlie's War is actually out of step with the times we live in. It could never be originated today, not at all.
Well,
so all this stuff is being knocked out, and the publishers, of course, they're the gatekeepers.
Yeah,
those are the books that will be published. If someone submitted an academic book, Haig, Butcher of the Somme, it just wouldn't get published. So there is massive censorship. And why are the publishers doing this? Because they are part of the establishment, and for all the diversity of names, the majority of them are actually all Random House anyway.
Yeah, sure.
So that's the kind of climate in which comics is on the edge of all this. And so it's kind of convenient that some people say, oh, comics shouldn't be political or whatever. Well, you know, as I say, the Bash Street Kids is political in one sense. Action Comic was very political. It's showing the point of view of the oppressed, the working class, anti-establishment, and so on. After all, comics in particular are really, when you drill down far enough, it's about battles between good and evil.
Yeah.
And what you've got really, in the case of, just to be specific, in the case of General Haig, is you have an evil man, part of an evil establishment, who is responsible for the mass murder of a generation.
Yeah.
And you know, so if you're going to do stories about good and evil, well, what does it come down to? Well, the only thing you can do, perhaps, if it's Marvel and DC, is, well, you can do terrorists and thinly disguised versions of, you know, Islamic figures, or inevitably you just have psychopaths, because psychopaths are safe. You know, you can have any number of Joker figures doing terrible, evil things. Because it's not challenging the status quo. And, of course, the heroes, inevitably, are tycoons. We're meant to look up to them. It's the class system that's, you know, we're only too familiar with in the British Isles, that comes across in the States, where you look up to, you know, tycoons like Bruce Wayne.
Well, it's very interesting. You've hit on something here with I guess
your voice has gone for a moment there, Mark.
Oh.
I think is it back?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Yeah,
good. Well, you've hit on something very interesting, and that is that, you know, comic books, along with any sort of publishing houses, I guess, want to have a narrative of sorts. With Charlie's War, I agree with you. I think we both listen to or read one of the same writers, a girl called Caitlin Johnstone. So I'm going to put my conspiracy hat on to a degree here and say that it's bad for Western economies when the population don't have a positive view of warfare.
Yeah, Caitlin is one of my favourite authors. Yeah, like herself, I subscribe to her her blogs, and they're terrific.
Well, I think what she sort of hit upon, and obviously guys like Glenn Greenwald and John Pilger sort of hit upon it. Now, I would say I'm not far left. I'm more of a centrist, but I do believe that there is obviously. Like I say, conspiracy, tinfoil hat time. I believe that there's a deep state economy, and that they run politics, and to a lesser degree that spirals into the media, etc., etc. And so it's it obviously makes sense that the establishment do not want you to think negatively about warfare, because war economies, especially in America's economy is built on warfare. It's an imperial expansionist, country. It likes to masquerade as a republic, but I ultimately believe that it is, one of the last empires. So, whenever we talk about their superheroes, it's quite interesting because, as you say, there are a lot of, Tony Stark, Iron Man, he's a former war profiteer, Batman's a billionaire. All these characters are all, they are establishment. But what's interesting is you're seeing a new type of politics creep in now, one that the average reader is complaining about, and that is you're seeing sort of identity politics and a lot more liberal mandates making their way into comics. So what interests me is you were doing this in the 1980s to greater effect with, as far back as the late 1970s. Yet you were managing to get away with it. And that fascinates me because there's been such a backlash in modernity about, these new characters. And I feel a lot of it's due to bad storytelling. But
unfortunately so, yeah, because if you're going to have a counterculture character or something where gender is being challenged in some way, it's still got to be a good story. So if it's a bad story, then the message is not going to come across.
Well, yeah, and the thing is that you've done this with things like Third World War. You did that for Crisis, Finn, the ABC Warriors, and Nemesis. All these things were blatantly anarchic. They leaned towards a heavy anti-establishment direction. But the thing was, I came on board 2000 AD with ABC Warriors. That's what drew me in. It was absolutely fascinating, the idea that these sentient war robots, who were now essentially peaceniks, of a sort, and they were working for the forces of, chaos. So, what fascinates me is how can people look at what you were doing in the 1980s and become so ham-fisted in their attempts now? Because that stuff, I go back and read it now. I read the mega collections that come out, and it is still as potent.
Well, yeah, I'd have to sort of read one specifically to give a really defining answer on that. But what I would suspect is the case that, for me, it's the only way I can write. I have actually tried writing more what you might call middle of the road stuff, and that hasn't really sort of worked. So for me, the stuff I'm writing is very much an extension of who I am. It's what I believe in. But if someone else is writing something counterculture, as opposed, in other words, because they think it's hip or cool or whatever, it's not gonna work. You've got to really mean it.
Yeah.
So, for example, I seem to remember on New Statesman in Crisis, particularly enjoying John Smith's rendering of, I think he had a gay superhero, which at that time I think was quite remarkable, and for all I know, it might even be today. But he was obviously writing from the heart, and so that's what came across,
Yeah.
So maybe some of these stories that you're mentioning, perhaps they're not actually written from the heart, and therefore people are going to go, that's too preachy, or it's a bit jarring. I know they've had all kinds of gender changes in Marvel, but I'm not up to speed on exactly, who's who and what's what.
Well, again, I think you hit the nail on the head, Patrick, because I think problems that the readers have had with these things is that they've seemed very ham-fisted, and they didn't seem legitimate. They seemed like, I think there is a cynicism in publishing that if you, I've heard this modern term a lot, virtue signaling, and it's where you signal that you're virtuous and that you support specific causes, but it's all just an empty veneer, really. It's nothing.
Yeah,
but
that does seem to be going on now, doesn't it? In comics. I'm sure it's virtuous in a good way, but I did notice that there's a 2000 AD summer special, which is all written and drawn by women, and I think. Hopefully it works and hopefully it's a success, but it does strike me as being virtuous in the way that you're describing.
Yeah. Well, I think with the summer special, the thing is, I can see where the backlash has come from, because I would sort of consider myself an old school liberal, The way I look at it is I'm an egalitarian. I'm all for equality and basic support for people. So what strikes me as odd is whenever people are sort of jumping over themselves to make a point, or it's almost like they're trying to outdo each other to see who can be the most virtuous or who can be the most upstanding and upright and things like this. I find. What sort of repels me whenever it seems like it is, it's got a corporate end. It's got there's a sort of secret mandate. I can at the same time I understand appealing to a broader demographic and saying to more female readers, well, this is a space that you can come. We've got female creators, but at the same time, whenever it's got that sort of corporate end, I can't help but look at it and go, well, it's sort of cynical,
It comes down always to whether you're writing or editing from the heart, and if you're telling the truth, then you really haven't got anything to worry about. It's only when you're adopting a pose and saying, okay, this is a cool issue at the moment, so let's do some of this. That is not going to work, and I wouldn't want to get too much into the complexities of Crisis, but there was an element of that in the editing. It was like, let's be cool, so let's have a story like Alan Moore's Watchmen, and let's do something political about third world hunger. Which was an issue still is an issue, but it was particularly in the it was really in your face at that time. And so, when it's a little calculated like that, in other words, let's try and do something adult. I'm not sure that particularly works. So, that was a problem on Crisis, because you had a split audience. You had some readers who wanted what you might call adult superheroes, like Alan Moore's Watchmen, and then you had others who were interested in the politics of food, which was centre stage at that time. They're not really compatible with each other, and I think it's an editorial assumption to say that they are. In other words, they're both issues that what should we say, teenagers and so on would be into. It doesn't really work for me, that combination. So, the one lost out to the other, and it was a bit unfortunate, really. Even back then, there are those examples of, corporate thinking, and that isn't really how you should do something. If you want to, write something or produce a comic, edit the comic, whatever, you have to be driven by something. What is it that you really want to say? What is it you really want to do? And you deviate from that, and the audience is going to find you out.
Yeah, readers can really tell when you're being disingenuous, can't they?
Yeah. They're, and I think young audiences are possibly sharper and less tolerant than older audiences, where maybe they don't care anymore.
Yeah, and I think you become quite complacent in your reading habits. I know for a fact that I've read stuff out of habit. It has just become part of my routine, and while I might grumble about it, I'm not necessarily as I wouldn't be as vociferous as, say, somebody who's it's like they say, revolutions are for the young, and while I don't entirely believe that's totally true. I do feel that there's a passion with youth, and definitely whenever I was in my 20s, I feel like I was a lot more attuned to things than I am now. In my 30s, whenever I've become quite, relaxed about a lot of things, I guess, and probably a bit more.
The thing is, there's nothing wrong in just sitting down and enjoying a good old-fashioned Agatha Christie style thriller or whatever.
Yeah.
Why not? Switch your brain off for half a day or something. But not everything, I suppose, has to have edge. I certainly, from time to time, will try and read something cozy. But unfortunately, I keep thinking, oh God, this isn't really good for me. Why doesn't the pace speed up? And that's because of comic background, where a lot of the success of those early stories in Battle, Action, and 2000 AD, and I should add, DC Thompson's had the same approach as we did, except that they were more conservative. But here's the thing about them. This is slightly exaggerating, but not much. Sometimes in a 6-page Mac 1, we were practically telling a novella. 6 pages, for God's sake. In other words, the story has a beginning, middle, and an end. It has lots of content. There's none of the slowness. We've all experienced these slow novels where you think, oh, for God's sake, get on with it. And comics certainly, at that time, were very full of content. In other words, things really move fast. And I'm still inclined to that direction. You look at the best Doctor Who's on television. It's the ones where things are really happening all the time, where there isn't, there's not too much waffle on flight decks of spaceships and things. But it's got to be genuine. The minute that the audience suspects that, this is just padding, with people running around down corridors, trying to look desperately urgent and so on, you're done for. So there's got to be this strong story. The thing with strong stories is that it is an art form, and not everyone seems able to do it.
Well, you've tapped into another really interesting thing here, Pat. And sorry, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Yeah.
You've tapped into another really interesting thing, and that is the change of the form. Now, I first noticed this with TV shows sort of supplanting films, in that they developed this more long form style. So shows like The Wire or The Sopranos, say, became very, very popular because you could do these massive stories and character arcs, whereas formerly you would have seen that sort of complexity condensed into an hour and 30. And now I've noticed it has become it's become an element in comics as well. So instead of having an action strip where it was self-contained and very fast-paced and a lot was happening, they seem to take it for granted that the readership is they're steady, they're going to come back, for the next issue, or they've been there for the previous ones, and so can just dip into these lengthy stories that, I mean, I find, in older stories, you were introduced to everyone. In a way, you were introduced to what the world was very quickly, especially if you look at the early Rogue Troopers. They always give you a preface as to what was happening. But nowadays, you just sort of, if you show up as a reader, you have to go in cold, almost.
Yeah, that's always been a challenge on weekly comics. And one of the reasons why the stories were so intense was because, first of all, they had huge circulations, but we also had huge competition with each other. So we were really fighting for our audience all the time, and we got instant feedback from the audience. In other words, if they didn't like a story, my God, they would let you know with these votes. They'd write in pretty objectionable letters. So you were really kept on your toes. And it's a great training. But, of course, that no longer exists because what you have, I mean, for a start, 2000 AD, for example, has an older audience now. And so they're probably a lot more tolerant, or certainly a lot more civil, which is nice. But yeah, they can be a bit more laid back about the thing. And I don't know. I mean, you can't recreate the past, but the whole thing about a weekly comic is the cliffhangers and the edginess and so on. And you mentioned the Wire, and so yeah, let's pick on the Wire as an example. The Wire is superb, but my God, it can be a slow burn, and it does take a lot of getting into.
Oh, yeah.
Now, by comparison, I would say, and perhaps I'm biased because I do like it a lot, Peaky Blinders is pretty accessible, and it's fast-moving for the most part. It doesn't have... and even if you don't know exactly what's going on, you kind of get the gist of it. I think that's a role model for comics today, perhaps. In whatever is a science fiction equivalent or whatever. I mean, I suppose you could say it's a British Godfather or something like that. It's gangsters who are made to look cool in a particularly British way. And my God, if anyone could make Birmingham look cool in 1920, massive respect to them. That's phenomenal. So I don't know. I mean, if you've got comic stories that are using something like the Wire as a role model, or perhaps elements of the soap operas in the Sopranos, or perhaps even some of the slower police procedure stories, I'm not so sure that that's such a great idea. I don't see any reason, really, why we can't, continually draw on the original energy of the original comic. Some stories just won't work anymore because times have changed, but an awful lot do. And even look at Spider-Man, which came out before 2000 AD, and as far as I know, it's still got its energy and its following.
Yeah, it's what you said. There's quite interesting about. There's nowhere left really that where you can get those stories where they're condensed into a short strip and they're very action packed. The only place I can think of really is in the Future Shocks. The reason
occasionally that you're right. I think in broad terms you're right. Speaking for myself, every so often Rebellion will come up and say, do you want to do a 6-page story about there's one about Slough Feg, for example. Now that was as fast paced as anything I've ever done, and there's a recent one-off single episode Slain that's the same. And I've actually gone back to pacing up much faster again. I think these things you always have to keep. There's no constant. I mean, if you paced all your stories really fast for a long time, at some point that too would be open to criticism. You say, "Oh, wait a minute. When are you going to draw breath? When are you going to develop the characters a little more, or whatever it is?" But I actually think it is possible to do not just what I did in the 70s and 80s, but D.C. Thompson's did as well, and to do it perhaps in a slicker, more sophisticated way today. But using, if we need role models, using role models like Peaky Blinders to say, okay, that's how they do it. I think there was another one, was it Taboo or something by the same author?
Oh, yeah.
Very fast-paced, and so it can be done. I mean, it always comes down to this thing of, are there good writers out there? And if there are, they'll find a way to do it. Yeah. That's always assuming that there are the incentives to do it in comics, which aren't always the case, unfortunately.
Well, I think you're right there. And what interests me, you pick up on something that you said there. It's the craft and the writing. I remember whenever I started, obviously I floated around. I do a lot of stuff for fanzines, which I think is a really good testing grounds, because I was talking to Peter Duncan about this last week. He is small press, and ultimately you get that experience where someone will give you feedback, as opposed to with a larger publication, your stuff's likely going to end up on the slush pile, and if an editor gets back to you, they will do so in a very succinct manner, because they don't have a lot of time. And so small press is a great proving ground, but also you're forced into doing very fast-paced stories and condensing plot, character, action, and just to sort of addendum this point, one of the best guys I came across to learn that craft was your recommendation, and that was Robert McKee with his book Story.
Yeah, I mean, Robert McKee is fantastic in that direction, and I think at some point in the near future he will probably retire. Yeah. And I imagine when he does, his lectures will be available on, well, they probably won't be free.
Yeah, sure.
But maybe they'll be on YouTube if you're lucky. But they'll certainly be cheap enough. I mean, I've actually gone to one of his seminars. I think it was a 2 or 3 day event. And it was a mind blast. Absolutely fantastic. And but yeah, the book and the audio book really brings out things that I think we can always learn from. I mean, it's certainly in the back of my mind that every couple of years or so I should reread Story just to keep myself in the tram lines, and just to make sure I still know what I'm doing. I haven't gone gaga or something. And I think that's I think one of the advantages of Robert McKee, and I have mentioned this elsewhere, but I'll mention it here because it might be of some comfort to writers who are struggling to get in somewhere, is a lot of editors, and I shan't be specific on this, but some of them have their own agenda, and so if you which isn't necessarily the quality of the product or even the quality of the book or comic or whatever. So it's good to have a guru. And Robert McKee makes an excellent guru. There are others out there. But if you've got him as a guideline, then when an editor says, I didn't think this was very good because blah, 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 you can think to yourself, well, Robert McKee would agree with that, or Robert McKee would think you were wrong. Of course, you need to keep your mouth shut, because if you say to a script editor, as I think I did on one occasion, that Robert McKee thought A, B, and C. They don't like it. There is only one God, and that is the script editor. So you need to be discreet about it, but it's invaluable to have that. But I mean, it always comes down, I think, to what drives people as writers, and I think we're all of us different. And in my case, it's pretty obvious what drives me, which is anything that's anti-establishment in one form or another. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a well that's never going to dry up.
I would agree.
But that isn't true for everyone. There might be someone else who... let me see if I can think of an example. Spielberg, if you look at his movies, he's obsessed with happy families. In my view, in a slightly questionable way. But so arguably... for a writer, everything might be geared around families. In other words, because he really needs to say something about his own family or her own family, and so that's the driving force for that person. And so I think the problems arise when writers don't follow their own star and they think, I should write something. That's kind of really cool and all the rest of it, rather than thinking, well, what am I into? Am I into families, or am I into ecology, for example?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, a lot of people today might well have issues to do with conservation, ecology, wildlife, and so on. So that can be translated into science fiction. As easily as anything else, and I worked some of that in Flesh with the whole dinosaur thing, and so on.
And also Finn, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the whole green thing there, very, very much so. And on the subject of Finn, I found, to my delight, although it does seem an awful long way off, it's been penciled in, I'm told, for 2020, which does seem an awful long time away. I mean, for God's sake.
That is an awful long time.
I don't get the logic of that, because, I mean, there's all these other books that Rebellion reprint, which were not successful first time round, but obviously have a collector interest, but I always thought it was, Hibernia books or Bear Alley that were kind of catering for that nostalgia market, whereas Finn is a very commercial character who had a very, very wide appeal. I mean, he was more successful than Slane. And I can remember at the time when I discovered that he was more popular than Slane, being a little bit put out by it, thinking, shit, that wasn't meant to be the way. I thought Slane was meant to be the stronger character. Not so. And anyway, at least he will be finally out there in 2020. Well, my God.
I'm really looking forward to it, mate, because, again, it was one of those strips that I was... it was the period whenever I was getting into comics, and I thought the whole concept behind it was great. The Newt gods, the idea that there was this sort of hidden Illuminati that, were trying to sort of shepherd humankind in the direction that they wanted. It played against that anti-establishment, and then you had Finn himself. He was a sort of really interesting character. I loved his design. I loved the Cloak of Shadows. The fact that he was a working class guy, he was a taxi driver. All that sort of stuff appealed to me. And again, he felt authentic. He
was authentic, and just to divert a little bit here on that subject, I mean, it was co-written with my friend Tony Skinner, who is a practicing pagan, and so forth. And so I think more than one reader actually realised, this seems very authentic. And one of them wrote to us and said, I've been I'm really interested in the craft and so forth. And anyhow, he ended up joining Tony's pagan community.
Huh.
He's still there to this day, or he was the last time I met up with them about 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. I've actually got a friend who is, just to divert slightly, I've got a friend who is deeply involved in chaos magic, and he is fascinated by a lot of the ideas that you've put into stuff like Finn, and he has been on to me. Anytime I speak to him, he always says, "Ask Pat Mills. Has he ever dabbled in chaos magic, etc., etc.?" So,
well, you see, I mean, and the answer to that is sort of not chaos magic as such, but other what you might call esoterical systems.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely. And this, of course, brings me back to something that when I sort of started in comics, I just assumed, because it was the 70s and so on, that it would be just like any other cultural form. It would be, like comics rock and roll. Mm-hmm. And I quickly discovered that the industry was horribly conservative. Horribly. Like, I'd never seen anything like it. And just like any sort of anyone influenced by the 60s, I was going to try and change that. I didn't think what I was doing was that unique, that there were plenty of other people doing it in their own different ways. And so, if you think of rock and roll and so on, and all the sort of wonderful songs that have come out of it and so on, and then how conservative the music scene is today, not completely, but there's a lot of conservatism.
Sanitized.
It's the same. I think it's the same with comics. It's like the world we live in is a bit dire, isn't it, in places?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've got quite an interesting view on things. I think we live in what is probably one of the most prosperous eras of human history in terms of Western society. Western society lives in a bubble of decadence. We are truly overwhelmed almost by the amount of decadence. I mean, everyone has a supercomputer in their pocket. Everyone is to some degree well catered to, but at the same time, we live in a time that is decadent, but also in terms of the corporatism, in terms of the level of control and power that you have in your everyday life, in terms of the level of sort of global poverty and things like that. There's never been a time like it. I mean, there's actually more slavery now than there ever has been.
There's more what now than there's ever been?
Slavery.
Really?
Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me, but
Well, especially around Syria and places like that, the level of human trafficking is off the scale, and this is all born out of sort of Western warfare and stuff like that. So it's it's an interesting time to be alive, because if you're a Westerner, I think it's very easy to fall into this sort of somnambulent ignorance where you're just sort of walking through life in a malaise. But if you look at the bigger global picture, then it's hard not to be appalled and shocked at what we're doing to the planet. You know what I mean? It's a
and you see, that's one of the challenges. What I think used to happen in the past in comics, and I'm not so sure it works as successfully today, is that what should we say? Younger people were quite into seeing their worldview being challenged. And maybe that's always how it is. Mm-hmm. But today, so many people do not want their worldview challenged. That it sets up that cognitive dissonance that makes them feel uncomfortable, and they have to believe, what they're told on television and so on. I mean, it's very Orwellian, but it does seem to be how things are. Whereas the sort of comic stories of the past could present, really alternative cultures and alternative ways of being and so on. And Well, I mean, I hope they're still doing it, but I don't hear about any, and
You're right. You're absolutely right. You've hit on another. You sort of keep hitting on talking points that I wanted to bring up, but you're sort of getting to them before I can get to them. But what's interesting with this again is that comic books at the moment is definitely it's got a liberal mandate, but it seems disingenuous. It seems like it's got a corporate sort of push behind it. So a lot of the young authors who are sort of coming in, and they're writing stories about, say, a gay character or a trans character or something like that. These things are worth discussing, but they're being sort of handled in a ham-fisted sort of a way. And also, I feel that where it used to be a discussion, it was subversive enough that there was give or take, that you as a reader could make up your mind. I feel that nowadays, in terms of any sort of content that's being pushed, you either agree with it or you're a Nazi or you're a bigot or you're a fascist or whatever the buzzword of choice is. You are this thing. Whereas I come from a background, I studied philosophy for my degree. I'm interested in debating people and having the conversation, and I feel that the conversation is more and more getting shut down. People don't want to talk to you. They don't want to have their opinions challenged. They just want you to agree with them, and if you don't agree, then you are whatever, insert slur, insert smear,
Yeah, I think maybe things are quite polarized, I suppose.
Yeah.
Maybe it is the times we live in. I'm thinking of one example recently where my wife Lisa and I got into an argument with a couple of friends who were sort of endorsing the actions of Tommy Robinson as the Yale guy.
Yeah.
And it was surprising how heated it got. It got very, very heated, very, very quickly. It was quite and I've come across other people who, I don't know, I thought were, what should we say, either centre or left of centre. Mm-hmm. And, there's that same kind of stoked up feeling that Robinson is a hero, which I don't subscribe to, and it's funny how it can get really it got out of hand.
It can get ugly. It can, and
it's just like I don't know. Maybe what's happening with society is it's getting more kind of polarized in some way.
I think it is, and I think a lot of it comes down to social media. The lack of context, the fact that we're closer than we've ever been, but due to this sort of lack of context in how we post about things, how we communicate, things are becoming more, how would you say, angry and disconnected. Whereas you and I can have a conversation and we would disagree, perhaps, on certain points, we at the end of the conversation we could say, oh well, I don't agree with you on such and such, but, we can continue to go on and be friends and live our lives. Unless, of course, it's something serious, like, something like, I feel, certain people should be genocided or something like that. Obviously you can't, you can't have that sort of a civil conversation.
It does make things that much more intense, I suppose, than ever before. In other words, it's sort of 9 o'clock in the morning, and you're suddenly presented with these images of what's happening in Gaza, and I think you get this kind of annoying troll factor as well, where some things which really do seem quite self-evident, you get somebody trying to challenge you and say, well, is this actually the case, and so on. And, on the subject of trolls, my first experience of this was a Sandhurst-educated troll.
Uh-huh.
Or at least that's how I what I took his response to be.
Mm-hmm.
When Charlie's War first came out, they were going to get an introduction, God knows why, by someone who was a Sandhurst lecturer.
Oh, okay.
And so he sort of he really didn't like Charlie's War. So he was sort of saying, well, yes,
sure.
I know it has its following. However, he's got this wrong, this wrong, this wrong, and this wrong. And so I said to the publishers, well, look, I don't mind if you publish this guy's stuff. I quite enjoy the challenge of it, as long as I have the right to reply.
The rebuttal.
And of course, they say, oh, we're not getting into this. So, but anyway, off my own bat, I went and checked all the things that he said were incorrect, and it cost me 2 days of my time.
Yeah.
And I would venture to say he knew that they were correct. He was being a troll. In other words, it's very easy to say. I think an example in point was I had a fairly humorous incident where the British machine gunners used to fire their machine guns off to boil the water to make tea. And he said, I know he's got that from Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, but in fact that's not true. And so at great effort, I cross-referenced, and I found a couple of other sources that did say, yes, it is true. And the same with the others. So, I'm really wary of trolls these days because you can lose so much time checking it, and you think, well, why should I check it for your benefit? What am I, Reuters? It's like, so I try to ignore the trolls whenever I can.
Yeah.
Because often they're just challenging you for the sake of it, saying, well, what are your sources on this? Or, well, there's another side to that story, and so on. And before you know it, you can lose a day's work.
I agree with you. It's because, it's very easy to become sucked in, isn't it? Because someone challenging you and suddenly you feel
especially
like...
if it's something you feel really passionately about, and you have someone, on a Facebook comment who's carping about this or that, and having that ability to just ignore it or switch off is sometimes difficult. It's that came up recently on Accident Man, where someone was carping that the artists weren't acknowledged in the credits, and they were suggesting, I think, in effect, that it was my responsibility to ensure with the producers that they were acknowledged. And I was thinking to myself, oh my God, if we get into this, and there is there's a big backstory on it. It's like, I could be here all day, and writing it, and it roughly comes back to what you were saying. If you put it in just a couple of lines, you're not really getting to the heart of it. You've either so what I was actually thinking was that if these people were really interested, that what I might do on some future occasion is do what you're doing. In other words, do it as a messenger audio. And explain, because if you explain the whole circumstance of bylines and credits and why some things are possible and other things are not possible, before you know it, you've written 1,000 words.
No, absolutely.
And no one's going to read it, or they're just going to say, well, I still think you're wrong. You think, oh my God.
Well, I think you're absolutely right to, you see, it's a fine line to walk, really, from what I understand. Essentially, you have people in your timeline who are maybe, they might be trolls, or maybe they're just, it's hard to differentiate sometimes between somebody who legitimately has an issue. They might be a fan and a reader, or somebody who's just there to rattle your cage. Because like I say, on the internet, it's very, sometimes it's hard to determine the context of something. So I think what you're considering is actually a really brilliant idea in terms of how to get your point of view out there to somebody.
How to deal with it, I think that's what I'll do in future, because from time to time these sort of things come up, and I found if I just write a reply, just a couple of sentences to say, okay, well, actually, what was going on at the time was blah blah blah.
Yeah.
It won't get left there. There'll be a response to that, and then a response to this, and then it just spirals.
Yeah.
And you've either got to ignore it, but I think if it's something important, and things like, for example, creator credits. Are really important.
Okay.
That's a really important subject, and rebellion to their credit have actually, that's the one area where I don't have any disagreement with them over. They do put proper credits everywhere, but in film it's not the same. Film it's much messier and. Yeah, so, if it becomes an issue for, if there's people who are interested, then what I'll do is invite one of them to, ring me up like yourself, and we'll do a conversation on the subject, which we'll put out on Facebook. It might be that 1,000 words, which no one's going to read anyway.
Oh, yeah. Well, Pat, I think you've hit the nail on the head again, because this is where you really get to cut the wheat from the chaff. Because
you've faded, Mark. Your voice has faded a bit just there.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Oh,
yeah.
Good. Okay, well, I think, in inviting someone to have a conversation with you or debate a point, I think in that sense you really get to cut the wheat from the chaff, don't you? Because somebody's saying something on the internet, it's very easy to write something, have a blasé sort of response to something and then eject from the conversation, or to continue ranting while you're sat in the comfort of your house with your phone. But if you really stand by the strength of your convictions, I find you'll be prepared to talk about it and engage somebody. And I guess, Pat, that's where you would get to cut the wheat from the chaff. Because if someone has,
very much so. Yeah. I mean, if it wasn't a personal agenda or someone trying to score points, but if someone was genuinely interested in the whole issue of artist credits in film. I think it's an important subject. It's not one that I've pursued particularly, but I have a backstory of doing it in the past, and that's why I don't pursue it anymore, because the film producers made mincemeat of me. It was on the very first Judge Dredd film, and I was determined. Well, there was a group of us who were paid on the first Dredd movie. And I also felt that, their various roles should be acknowledged. And so I made a kind of issue of it. And feel like I stuck my head over the parapet.
Yeah.
And the producers eventually agreed to everyone concerned with the developing of Dredd and the art developing as well as the story. Getting a credit. So I thought, well, I won that one. No, I hadn't. I think I describe it as we're down there just before the Dolby Sound, or we used to be, in microtype. So they got their revenge on it. And I thought, Jesus, I've really been outgunned here. I mean, if you're going to take on producers on the subject of credits, you really have to think very carefully what you're doing. And you have to have a lot of support for it. And, it's not just something you can just randomly do. But it's an important thing. And I wish that the artists on Accident Man actually were named. But, as I say, there's a host of reasons why that never happened, which would take 1,000 words to explain.
I suppose it's difficult because people, they have this expectation of you as, you know, the creator and the guy who's, you know, you're the name that people are.
Clout. If only I did. If I had any clout, I'd be a monster. I think I have very, very little clout. I maybe had a little bit, perhaps in the 80s or so on, but I think those days are long gone.
Well, I think you did, and there's people who are still a little bit terrified of you know, having been on the wrong end of that clout. You know, I've heard stories of.
There's that's true, but then I make a point of. Yeah, I mean, when I say clout, I mean clout in terms of persuading publishers or film producers that they can, you know, in other words, saying, well, I think this should happen on the film, or I think this person should be credited, or that, or things to happen in, you know, in say, Rebellion books. And yeah, that's what I mean. Where that's concerned, I have absolutely no clout whatsoever, as I'm constantly reminded by Rebellion. So the only thing you can do in that situation, it seems to me, and I think I'm simply the only one doing it these days, is to speak out very loudly, and to if you are pissed off with a situation which seems unfair or unjust. To make it very clear that that's so, and so yeah, I do that from time to time.
Well, you really, I think there was an incident recently on.
You're fading again, Mark.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah, that's fine.
I think there was an incident recently to do with, was it creators' rights? Rico. And Rico, and yeah.
Well, yeah. Now the Rico one was a case in point. There, you see, I thought I pretty much had my what you might call my Mills verse sewn up. In other words, there had been several attempts to encroach upon it, and Rebellion had actually warned off someone in that particular instance and said, "Look, you know, back off, it's Pat's character." So there was I thinking, oh, I can relax now. So it came as quite a shock to me to see suddenly, my God, there are 3 Rico novels out there, and nobody has told me that they were coming. Like, why wouldn't you tell the creator of Rico?
Sure.
And B, they haven't said, well, you probably don't want to write them, but would you like to write a Rico novel? And so, yeah, that came as a huge shock. And as I pointed out to Rebellion, if you announce a thing, or if it's announced to me on Facebook, then I will respond on Facebook. If you tell me privately in advance and why, then I will respond in private. But if the first I hear of it is on Facebook, well, that's, you know, you've made it a public forum, so that's where I'm going to respond. You kind of it both ways. Yeah. And I think what did it in particular, really, where Rico was concerned, was that the author involved said, well, you know, it's only a small character, and I didn't think you'd be bothered. And I thought, well, actually, I mean, as I have made clear to Rebellion, I care about all my characters. There's probably some character somewhere I don't care about, but for the sake of the argument, I care about them all. Because, you know, if you create a character, it's a part of yourself that's gone out there and into the world. And Rico in particular was a very eerie experience, the way that was created. And not only was it a powerful story to write emotionally, but it went on to be the basis of the first Dredd movie.
That's right.
So it wasn't a small character.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what it comes down to is, if you don't fight your corner, no one else will. So hopefully that's, you know, that's the end of it. And I'm not going to look up on Facebook half an hour after we've end of this conversation and discover there's something else out there and think, oh my God, I really got to get out of my crown again on this, you know.
Well, what would you what would you say to the detractors? There are going to be detractors who will say, "Oh, Pat, well, you work in comics, you should know what to expect," and "Oh, Pat, you know, surely you've worked with other people's characters." What will you say to those people? Because they're gonna come out and ask, and I guess the best way to confront that would be
there's two things there. So let's take them one at a time. The first one is you work in comics, so you know what to expect. Well, the thing is, you create change by complaining and fighting your corner. You do not create change by just being an obedient wage slave and just doing what you're told. And that's why comics, so many comics, are crap, because there aren't so many people who, especially in America, they're locked into American health systems and so on. They're just got to do what they're told. They've lost their balls.
Yeah.
And if you look at all the really strong writers on 2000 AD, Alan Grant, Grant Morrison, Alan Moore, and so on, they've all in their different ways fought for rights and so on. So, if the argument is, no, you should just be a good little boy and keep your mouth shut, I think my reply to them would start with the letter F. And, just go away, because you're not part of my world, and I don't want you to be part of it. If you just want safe little stories, well, you probably shouldn't be reading 2000 AD. You should be reading Marvel or DC corporate comics. That would be just about right for you. To cover the other point, and I think it's a fair point as well. I've made this very, very clear. I think I covered it in Be Pure. And I've covered it elsewhere. I've covered it in blogs. Be Pure, just Be Pure's your book. I talked about Dan Dare. Mm-hmm. Now, we're talking back in the 70s at that time. And I have no problem saying that ethically or morally that was a mistake for me to bring back, because at that time I was part of that company system, and nobody had said to me, well, actually, this is wrong to take someone else's character. And if you look at a variety of successful writers at that time, they were doing similar things, and many of them various versions of Dan Dare. I would have thought today that the majority of us, with any integrity, would reject that. In other words, we all of us need to be so much more politically aware. So if anyone's saying, we should go back or we should remain in the antiquated, old-fashioned and morally reprehensible system of the 70s, I mean, I think whoever is saying that is really a troll at heart. They're just trying to make trouble, because, it actually says, in effect, I think, I think it says something like you waive your moral rights if you sell all your rights. So, how can morality be something that you waive to one side? Now, of course, the thing is, it takes a number of people like myself to create change. And I'm afraid that's not going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen is because unless I'm missing out on anyone that I'm not aware of, the younger generation of writers is just quite happy to take the king's shilling, keep their heads down, and just do what they're told. And that will be inevitably reflected in a poorer product. If you look at the strongest stories that come out of 2000 AD, that inevitably they've come from people who are much more outspoken and much more challenging. So, if you want obedient robots, if that's what Thar wants, that's what will happen. But it will be to the detriment of the comic.
Well, that's. I think you can, especially in American comics. I think you can see.
You've lost me again,
Oh,
Mark. I can.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you again. Yeah,
Oh,
it just goes for a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think, especially in American comics, we have the case where a lot of people are maybe just keeping their heads down and, as you say, taking the king's shilling. And it's something that I wanted to ask you about, actually, because if you look at the seismic reactions across the industry whenever 2000 AD came out, instantly you had this comic that wasn't just edgier, but it was authentic. It was sort of, it was being made by people who sort of deeply cared about what they were writing about, and this in turn influenced. You often hear how Vertigo comics couldn't exist without 2000 AD, and the imprint that line of comics made again was massive, because it was this adult themed comic line that 2000 AD had set the blueprint for. So I mean, you had these comics in the 80s that were really redefining the medium in a lot of ways. Things like Watchmen could never have been without 2000 AD. All of these complete. They created a shift in comics, and this couldn't have happened without the foundations that guys like yourself laid down. So my question is, do you think anything like 2000 AD could happen now? Could there ever be anything that radically changes things in the current environment, or has that been well and truly quashed?
I think it would seem to be quashed. Yeah. I mean, I think I can't see it. Well, I certainly can't see it coming out of, say, rebellion. I don't think they would have any desire to do that. I think maybe they would. I think they're to a large extent, a reprint house in terms of some of these classics of yesteryear, and I mean, the energy required to create something new like 2000 AD is enormous. And I think even though I've written Be Pure, where I kind of go through it almost step by step, I'm not sure it's completely understood. And in fact, I wrote the first section of a Slain book on the origins of Slain, so it's Slain the Wanderer.
Yes, okay.
I had to cast my mind. It's a book, incidentally, that's given away free with Goodnight John Boy, Volume 2 in the Readham and Wheat series. Now, when I came to writing that, I had to actually think back to how Angela Kincaid and myself actually created Slain, and I'd forgotten just how much went into it, how much thought, how much love, how much aggravation, and
research,
how many obstacles we had to overcome. And I'm sure if that's true for Slain, I'm sure it's true for many of the other great characters that comprise 2000 AD. So, how would you possibly recreate that? I mean, we all have a love of anthology comics, and I think all of us would like to see something else like that out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's such a massive commitment. It took me a year of my time to do 2000 AD, and it was it was not an easy process.
Yeah, well.
So theoretically there could be someone out there who wants to do the same thing, but I suspect it was a unique set of circumstances that led to 2000 AD.
Yeah.
What's far more likely, and it can be equally encouraging in different ways, is that you could get independent comics that perhaps more modestly try to do the same thing. And I'm thinking of, is it Awesome Comics, where I've just read a couple of issues of that, and the standard of story and art. It's an anthology of 3 stories, which have a kind of action comic tone to them, and but it's got its own unique identity. So I could imagine other independents doing things like that, but getting it out to a wide audience,
that's the hard part.
Is so difficult,
That's the hard part, and
these things shouldn't be impossible. I mean, you've got video games like Grand Theft Auto, which is is kind of gritty sort of tone to it. So there's an audience that still looks for things like action had and science fiction. I mean, there's endless riffs on things in 2000 AD. I mean, I saw there's a computer game out at the moment called something like Blasphemy or Blasphemous, which certainly looks like it's been influenced by Nemesis, to put it gently.
Well, what's interesting, Patrick, is that if you look at it, we're sort of talking about Western comics, or more appropriately, I guess we're talking about UK and US comics, whereas there's absolutely enormous market in France. It's actually the second largest market behind Asia, I believe.
That's correct.
And you've got, in Asia, you literally have comic books that cater to every demographic. And in France, I think you've got a much broader demographic. You publish your title, Requiem Vampire Night, which you need to remind me of the artist's name. He's absolutely fantastic. He's a stunning artist. Whenever I picked up those volumes, I just I was blown away by the not only the quality of the artwork and the writing, but also just the product itself. It was nicely bound. It was a beautiful book. So there's these other markets out there that are very much doing different things outside of UK comics and US comics, and I think if especially if you go back to the origins of European comics in Metal Urlant, and you had Moebius, Alexander Jodorowsky, guys like that who were doing very interesting things. Enki Bilal, I think he still does his stuff still pops up in heavy metal, but these guys, they're all doing very interesting things in the European market, and I would love to see, comics, in UK and US take these ballsier stances, do more interesting, subversive stuff, and maybe drop the preachiness, which comes across as inauthentic to a lot of the readers, and it's certainly, especially with the old guard, it's just turning them off.
Well, I mean, in the case of France, the reason that these books are so beautiful, I suppose, is that they're creator-owned in conjunction with the publisher, and therefore you have the artist can often take a year or more over a book, and they come out and they're absolute works of art, and it's a system that actually hasn't been adopted by the UK, which tends to subscribe to the American model of waiving your moral rights, which is a ridiculous idea.
Yeah.
And so that's why French books are just so damn good, because the financial reward is so much greater. France has its own problems with books, but they're but they're the problems of publishing you have the world over. There's always problems. I mean, in the case of France, the biggest challenge is that there's too many bande dessinées coming out for the number of retail outlets. In other words, the audience isn't big enough. It's really big, but it's not as big as they would like it to be. So what happens is that when you're, and this has happened to me, if you have a bande dessinée comes out, a new one, it's like a Hollywood first weekend. If it doesn't sell in the first weekend, you're screwed.
Yeah, okay.
And so in other words, it goes on the shelves, but there's so many books that they want to have out there on those shelves. So if your book isn't hooking the audience, it's remaindered and you're done.
Gotcha.
So it's a bit scary.
Yeah.
And it has happened to me a couple of times, but not in the case of Requiem or in the case of Shah, the predecessor. And both of those worked well. But, that system would easily adapt to the British system. And what would happen there, for example, supposing I'd retired and the publisher wanted someone else to write Requiem, either as a text novel or as a bande dessinée. They still have the power to do that, but it's enshrined in the contract that the original author gets a percentage of the royalties.
Oh, well,
and, so it's common sense. So why these idiots go on about, endorsing an antiquated and old-fashioned system? I really have no idea. They really are trolls in the way they're thinking, because if they do their research, they'll see that in France you have a system which actually benefits publishers as well as creators. So this fear that publishers perhaps in the UK have that, it's all going to get taken away from them, so we've got to hang on to it all. It's ludicrous. The publishers in France are as authoritarian and as establishment as any in the UK, but they still reward the creators. So it's such a minor step to take, and the result would be that people will think, it's worth my while, creating Rogue Trooper or whatever it is, because if at some future point I get kicked off the series, I'm still going to get paid for it. And that's my gripe where, Jerry Finley Day is concerned.
Yes.
That he had all these characters that the readers loved, but editorial had decided that he wasn't cool enough for their tastes, and so he got pushed out, and that's sad.
It's such a pity. It's a real pity, and I think something similar with John Smith.
I don't know the backstory where John Smith is concerned, but I do know that several readers have said that he was pushed off one of his own series at very short notice. But because I don't know the circumstances, I can't comment on that one. I do know a little bit about Jerry's background and what happened there. The thing about Jerry as well, which I think I've said in Be Pure, and I certainly say whenever I get an opportunity, is that the whole comic revolution, that is a term that's often used to describe the process of battle, action, and 2000 AD, it actually all began with Jerry.
Yeah, that's right.
Me. And, I think for him to be ignored and also insulted by some people who really should know better. You see some of these insulting comments on Facebook about his work. But he started the comic revolution. He started it with Tammy. Yeah. Tammy led to battle, and it led to other things as well. But it was a direct stepping stone from Tammy, where they were at one point in girls' comics doing the most revolutionary things. And this was all Jerry's ideas. And predictably, he was absolutely loathed by the comic establishment at that time. They couldn't bear him. This is a maverick character. And, it's so he came along through battle. He came up with so many of the strongest stories in battle, like D-Day Dawson, Rat Pack, through to Action, Hellman, and then through to 2000 AD, and everyone knows those great stories there.
Yeah.
And you know what it is? People think, well, okay, we can replicate that with another writer. And this is the point I endlessly make, and it's certainly been proven true in my case, and I think it has in Jerry as well, that you can't. It's like people trying to imitate Alan Moore's Watchmen and saying, well, we can do that as well. No, you can't.
Yeah.
And shame on you for wanting to do so.
Yeah.
Back off. Create your own characters. Why do you want to leech off someone else? And shame on readers who encourage them. Really, I mean, shame on them, because we should, if you create something, what would you call it? It's an intellectual property.
Intellectual property.
Now, whether you own that intellectual property or not, it's still an intellectual property. And that's like a house. So if someone else comes along and helps themselves to your intellectual property, it's like your house being burgled. In fact, it's worse, because you can get over somebody burgling your house, but this is like a part of your soul.
Yeah.
That's been invaded, and someone's saying, "Yeah, we can imitate that. We'll have some of that." And it's really unjust. And as I say, I'm personally sad that that nobody that I'm aware of in a younger generation of writers or artists thinks this is remotely important. They're just quite happy to carry on taking the king's shilling.
Well,
the only thing I can do in response to that is to protect my stories as best I can, and walk away, which is to a large extent what I'm doing. I mean, if you look at 2000 AD, there's certainly nothing of mine at the moment, and there won't be for a long while to come. In other words, I progressively move away, because if you're not treated with respect, then there's only one thing to do, which is walk away.
Well, it's funny, hearing you talk about this reminds me of a lot of the creator battles that have been fought in, especially in US publishing. You had obviously the horrendous battle that Jack Kirby's family had, Jack Kirby, and indeed, his estate would later have, trying to gain, intellectual rights over some of the characters that he created, and some that he co-created with Stan Lee. I think there was other creators. I think there was maybe the creator of Ghost Rider. I might be wrong about that, and he had a difficult time getting any sort of accreditation. So these things, it seems to have, especially in the American market, it seems to be that that there is a younger class of writer who want to pay homage to the stories that they loved, rather than necessarily creating new, or the characters they loved, rather than necessarily creating new characters. And I have heard people, I know of people who have showed massive interest in, I would love to get my hands on Pat Mills' Slain, or I'd love to write the ABC Warriors. And I've always thought to myself, over Pat's dead body,
and you see that, well, the thing is, I think I've made it so clear, and I will make it incredibly difficult for them, one way or another. But that said, I mean, if one was getting a proper remuneration for someone to do it, supposing in, I don't know, say 2 or 3 years' time, I sort of retired from comics, and they said, well, okay, this person really wants to do a Slain story as a homage to you, which I find a little questionable, but okay, supposing it's true. Well, as long as I get a fee for that happening, then that's fine. But you know what? What they'll say, and this is why I doubt their sincerity, I really do. Because if someone wanted to do that, say, right, they'd say, but we can't, because the boss says that, that they can't reward Pat with that figure. So what they're creating there is a sense of powerlessness. And this is what sickens me, is that people seem to have no sense that they can be proactive in their own right. Now,
Sure.
what I would do in that situation, if they really wanted to do that, is to say, okay, you really want to write a Slane story because you let's say it's some kind of homage thing. Okay, so if you really mean it, that this is homage and not you leeching off me, then you pay me out of your own fee,
Yeah.
$5 a page or whatever it is to me, right? And I will publicize that and say that that's what you've done and commend you for it. But does anyone think like that? No, they don't. In other words, this is just a device to be a parasite. Now, as I say, if there are genuine people who really had a genuine reason why they wanted to do those kind of stories, that's a way of putting your money where your mouth is.
Yeah.
And it would be genuine. And not only that, it's also a way of breaking this whole old-fashioned stalemate system. But as I say, nobody seems interested in it. They just want to carry on with a system that's, it's 20th century. It's not 21st century.
No, you're right.
And, so the only option I have really is to protect my stories as strongly as I can and as aggressively as I can. And I, as you already know, I could be quite aggressive on it and probably more aggressive yet.
Yeah.
And then to just walk away, because that's all you can do, Mark, really.
Yeah, no, I understand, Pat, because especially with I think Marvel got around it with the whole work for hire scheme, where essentially the intellectual property rights of a character was owned by the publisher, and so you had a lot of talented guys, especially during the 60s and 70s, who created these characters that they never saw any remuneration from. And it's awfully sad. And like you say, that should really be of a time and a place. It shouldn't be something that we're taking with us into the 21st century. In the case of how the French do things, that is, you hold the intellectual property rights. And I think if you look at Image Comics, they, I think it's sort of a similar. It's somewhere between the French and the American model, in that it's obviously a meritocratic system. Your comic has to be good; it has to sell, otherwise there's no profit in putting it out there. But also you get paid as the creator, and you hold the property rights. So if it gets optioned for, I don't know, say like a TV series or a film or whatever, then those rights go to you. That seems to be the Image model, but obviously the rest of the comic book world hasn't quite caught up yet.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many solutions. There are so many ways around this. But complacency of saying, well, that's just how comics are, Pat should know, and we all have to put up with it, and why is he making a fuss? I mean, that's slave mentality. That's slave thinking. Yeah. And, it's worthless. Yeah. And out of that slave thinking, you get slave stories and slave writers and slave artists. And you can often see it, people. I mean, the reason I feel particularly so passionately about it is because I saw so many, there were so many writers and artists who were behaving like that in the 70s. And I certainly got rid of them as much as I could, where if they were involved on any of my stories. But then there are also wonderfully talented people who I also really encouraged, because they had flair and spirit. And I think having flair and spirit also means that you stand up for yourself rather than just be a humble wage slave.
Yeah, I think as well, one of the things is there's a lot of people, and I would to an extent include myself in here, where you are actually genuinely you're amazed and overjoyed by the idea that you're getting to work on comics. And so instead of, you're standing up for yourself and, being very forthright, a lot of people would tend to kowtow. Now, I'm not
I can understand that, and that was my experience when I started in comics. So you have a year or so where you're getting your feet under the table, and then you look around you and you say, okay, well, I've been in the business for a couple of years now. I've proven that I have some ability. Now, is it possible that, from here on in, I can actually make decisions that have the right moral basis? I mean, the first girls' comic story that I wrote with John Wagner, we had actually taken over from a writer who had said, if you mess around with this script again, I'm walking. And this whole thing that happens so often with publishers, it becomes a power base, a power thing. So they said, okay, well, we're going to mess around with it, and then you can walk. So we had his episode 1, and we had to carry on from there. Now, that was because we were just starting.
Yeah.
But a few years later down the line, I wouldn't do that again. I would say, well, I'm not going to have anything to do with this guy's work because it's his product.
It's his stuff.
So I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
But it's totally understandable when you're getting your feet under the table. You're not in a position to challenge anyone. And you're therefore grateful for
you're just happy to be there.
Yeah, it's totally understandable. I mean, I think it'd be naive of me to say otherwise.
Yeah. Well, you talked about girls' comics, and this is something that sort of fascinates me, and that is that people talk nowadays that comics has been an almost exclusively male-dominated industry, and I believe maybe at an insider level, it is largely male-dominated. But in terms of the readership, in terms of demographics, at one stage, girls' comics were absolutely enormous. They had a huge circulation, and you were indeed part of that with Misty.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And of course, that follows what you might call a larger publishing trend, that women generally read a lot more than we do.
Yeah.
And that was reversed in girls' comics for a number of reasons. But first of all, just to confirm this, Tammy, for a brief period, I think its circulation was about 250,000, and you had Jackie, which I think its circulation may have been 1 million. I don't know. It's huge sales figures. But it got undermined because there was, a number of things. I mean, first and foremost, female journalists didn't want to actually work on girls' comics. And a lot of guys gravitated towards male comics. I got moved on to them to create Battle and Action and 2000 AD. And there's a bit of me that really regrets it. And so I sort of came back to it on Misty. But I saw myself, even to this day, I see myself first and foremost as a girls' comic writer, because it involves emotion and plot complexity that's often missing, because what can happen, as you know, in boys' comics, this guy turns up with a Simon Bisley-style massive gun and just blows someone away. And, and a male audience is going to be happy with that. There isn't a female equivalent of that. And no, female readers are going to want a bit more. I prefer that. But, it should be, there is a case. If ever there was a case for origination, it would be girls' comics. And by that, I don't mean, feminist comics or comics aimed at, women in their, say, late teens, 20s or whatever. I'm really talking about that very difficult age group that well, I don't find it difficult, but it seems to confound everybody else. There's an age group somewhere, and this applies to boys and girls, somewhere between about, say, 10 to about 13. And it is particularly acute with a female readership, because of the sort of changes in their lives and so on. You'll tend to find young adult books for them and so on, but for comics, there isn't anything
that
I'm aware of, and but it's a very specific age group. It's they want drama, they want emotion. At that age group, they're not interested in romance or anything like that. It kind of Grange Hill, if you like.
Yeah,
and that market is still there, and no one's catering for it.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think maybe one of the best examples of that is the Hunger Games books.
Yeah, it's a really good. Hunger Games is such a good example of that, and I mean, when the films came out, I was looking at the audience in a coach to cinema, and there was a surprising number of young women. Well, I say surprising. I mean, they were there and they were watching it because I think, hey, for the first time, there's something that's a role model that's right for them.
Well,
and, and it's so important that kind of, and it's not difficult to produce those kind of stories. Stories like Hunger Games. I mean, there's any number of stories in Ginty. I don't think there's any quite as strong as Hunger Games offhand, but certainly they're strong in their own different ways. There's my Land of No Tears, which Rebellion have recently reprinted with Malcolm Shaw's The Human Zoo. And I mean, I reread it the other day, and it's fast moving, and it's catering for that audience that we've largely lost. And I've probably told you this, or you're probably aware of this, that it took years to get Misty Stories reprinted. And when they were first offered to Titan Books, Titan took them round, showed them round the different editors at Titan, and no one was interested, including the female editors. It's because everybody in this damned industry seems obsessed by men in leotards, and that's what's holding it back. I mean, but it's not the world at large. It's just people in the industry who seem to have this unwholesome and unhealthy, fascination with them. Well, anybody I meet and their kids, they don't seem interested in them. They might watch a Spider-Man film or whatever, but they don't collect the comics. It's almost turning it into some kind of hobbyist thing.
Yeah, it's becoming more niche. It
doesn't reflect the audience at large. I mean, if one wants to see, well, what's an audience at large? To come back to your earlier question about could something like 2000 AD come out tomorrow? I mean, it's not rocket science. All you would do is go along to see all those video games that are successful with this age group. So you look at Grand Theft Auto. There's got to be a story like Grand Theft Auto that would work in comics.
Oh yeah.
Assassin's Creed.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some depth to those games.
Oh, absolutely.
And Halo and so forth. So it shouldn't be impossible to create new comics for that. The danger, I think, is thinking, if it's aimed at kids, that we've got to somehow talk down to them or patronize them or be very nice and middle class, a bit like, the Phoenix and with that kind of Waitrose audience. Yeah, I mean, it's really not that. I mean, I'm sort of reminding myself, because sometimes I forget, it's not actually difficult to create a comic you just have to start by thinking, what does your audience want?
Yeah.
Not what you want, but what does your audience want?
Oh, so absolutely.
In the case of 2000 AD, I knew that the audience would want Mach 1. It wasn't what I wanted, but I could find something within myself to make that work. Maybe that's why it never lasted as a character, because it was almost an artificial construct, you know.
Sure.
Because at that time, the audience were obsessed by $6 Million Man.
Yeah,
so you have something like $6 Million Man, they're going to go for it.
Yeah, that's what's interesting there is that, you know, what you're talking about again in the end is authenticity, and I think it's that, you know, that desire to make characters that the audience will resonate with, and the authenticity that comes from the creator. Because, like I say, there's this, you know, corporate mandate to have I don't know, things like more diverse range of characters, but there's something lacking in the execution. And
yeah, I mean, when you mean ethnically diverse as well, or?
Yeah, well, just diverse, sexually, ethnically, in terms of, there's a push for diversity in every single avenue. As you know now, we live in a society where people are very, very aware of and very strident about their desire to have more inclusivity, you know, so more body types, things like that. And the thing is, I think they've always been there. But they were so well executed in the past that they didn't actually ruffle any feathers, or no one made a big deal about them.
Yeah, they stand out now. Yeah. And it does seem to be a lack of authenticity. I mean, I can remember back on Third World War when I wanted the story to move back to Britain and to get into black issues and, Afro-Caribbean and so on.
Yeah.
And I realized, I can remember at the time thinking, if I try and do this on my own, I'm going to end up with egg on my face.
Yeah.
People are going to go, well, what does he know? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or, what gives you the right to say this or that? In other words, it wouldn't feel authentic. So there was only one thing I could do, which I think was absolutely the right thing to do, which is I went out and I looked for a black co-writer, and I found one in the late Alan Mitchell.
Oh, Alan Mitchell,
We wrote stuff together, and because he'd had a background of, he worked for the Social Security, and he came out with the most outrageous things that a white writer alone could not say, because he could laugh. It's like a Lenny Henry thing, talking about his own community. It was an invigorating experience, and I don't think any of us I don't think we were ever really challenged on what we did. There was some resistance, though, to black heroes, and that's something no one ever dares talk about. It is there. It was there. I mean, hopefully it's gone now.
I think it's gone, but it definitely, I agree with you, it definitely was there.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
I said I agree with you. I think it's gone now, but it definitely was there, especially during the late 70s. You would have saw a lot of resistance to it. Early 80s, things seemed to soften a bit, but I think it's because you saw guys like Eddie Murphy, Richard Pryor, a lot of comedians who were breaking in and changing the zeitgeist, you know?
Yeah, so there was resistance to it originally, and even as late as the Crisis era, there was some resistance from white readers.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it, and I think I don't know how they made their views known, because it's quite a difficult thing to actually to say without seeming really appalling.
Yeah.
But they did make their views known because the editor, Steve McManus, told Alan and I that there was some resistance to some things, and we naively had thought rather like the things you're describing, with all the changes in cinema and so on, and and with the whole music scene and so forth, we didn't anticipate a problem, and we were quite taken aback when there was some resistance to it, but never any kind of what you might call complaints about the subject matter itself, because the stories we were telling we were telling stories about the black community and how they would react to some of the third world issues and so on. And some things we got right and some things maybe not quite so right. But it was very stimulating to do. And I still miss that that whole era. In fact, I miss the fact that, Finn, as I was telling you, is out in
2020.
In 2020, but I have to find out about Third World War. At the moment, I have no publication date for that being reprinted.
Well, I would love to see that book back in print, because the thing is, like you were talking about, really, it's interesting. I think liberals are naturally more inclined towards working in comics. Now, I think, the corporate structure is obviously you would have a more conservative element at the top end, but as creators, I think it's predominantly the liberal-minded who gravitate towards writing or drawing or whatever.
But it should be a subversive thing, and I always naively thought that younger generations of writers and artists would be more radical than I was, or other writers like Grant Morrison or Alan Moore. In other words, I thought the younger they get, the more the more challenging they would be. And I mean, maybe it's a sign of the times we live in that hasn't happened. There are some outside mainstream comics. There's a guy called Darren Cullen. That's Darren Cullen, Cullin. And he does anti-war comics. I think you'd describe him as a kind of Banksy of anti-war issues, if you like. He does guerrilla art, and he's produced, I think, one powerful anti-war comic on why not to join the British Army, and he also did some superb Action Man videos, which are a complete piss take on Action Man, which I believe is funded by the Ministry of Defence, the toy, which I think tells you everything. And they're so hard hitting that the Sun and the Daily Mail have trashed them in the past, which means that they really knew what they were doing. Now, you see, a guy like Darren, I think, is following in the tradition of Action and the early 2000 ADs. In other words, he's really out there.
He's telling,
I think that's what should be happening, rather than just everyone turning into wage slaves.
Well, I agree with you. I agree with you, but it's sort of like it's a difficult issue in a way, because while I guess my original point was I think liberal minds gravitate towards comics and creating comics, I think there is also a larger readership than just liberals. I think quite a conservative element also reads and enjoys comics, and so I guess it's difficult maybe for the upper ends, the managerial side of the comics industry, because they don't want to turn away, the conservative element who reads their comics by being overly radical, whereas at the same time they want, their hands are tied in a way. So, I mean, I
think that's that's probably that. Yeah, you've probably summed it up rather well there. That's probably how they think. Of course, the reality is actually the polar opposite, because, for instance, when Finn came out, it had a very wide following amongst counterculture people who would have included travellers, crusties, those kind of people. And so when Finn disappeared, it would have lost, if you like, its pagan readership. And I think the thing is, managements tend to be conservative by nature. But I think the reality is that for the most part, if you have stuff that's safe and middle of the road, it's never going to. You're never going to have a hit at the box office. You might chug along, and it might be careful. It might be all right, and you get by.
Yeah.
But I mean, what changes things is when someone reads something like Watchmen. You think, wow, this is really shaking up the industry. It's saying something. It was saying something at the time that had never been said before, and that must have shocked those kind of middle of the road guys who just wanted comics as a safe, repetitive nonsense. So you've got to. I mean, without doing it, it's got to come from the heart. But we have to go on surprising people, shall we say, rather than shocking them. You don't have to shock them. But surprising them. In other words, taking stories in new directions. And if you have that wet blanket atmosphere, which I think is so widespread in society, it just deadens everything.
No, I agree with you, and it's ironic because I think at the moment the counterculture, and it is the counterculture that you need to shake things up. If you look at all the great sci-fi that was coming out of the 70s, guys like Philip K. Dick, I mean, it was all attached to this really interesting, innovative counterculture that was shaking things up and making people uncomfortable. So I think what's actually happening at the moment is I think that the conservative establishment has decided that people want liberalism, although they want spoon-fed liberalism. So it's being fed to us in this sort of very safe, very sanitized way. And people know that it's not authentic. They know that it's ultimately, it's a lie. And so you can see it especially in American comics where, they want you to buy into. I mean, it's like the guy who owns Marvel Comics, the publishing end, is actually a Republican. He supports, he made donations to the Trump campaign. But if you look at his comic books, they've got this very spoon-fed liberal, sort of woolly liberalism almost. So it's interesting because clearly it is it's a corporate move, and that's why it feels illegitimate. And that's why readers can tell, because the comics that really changed things were written by people like yourself who were passionate, cared, wanted to genuinely shake things up, and they are the ones that, art changes how people think. It changes how society thinks, and good art really not just art or being edgy for the sake of it, or being bombastic for the sake of it, but really good art sticks in people's memories, and they can go back. I can go back and look at what I was doing whenever I read my first copy of 2000 AD. It was that powerful, and it stayed with me. It's the same with whenever I read Watchmen, or whatever it is. A really good writer with that authenticity, and if you've got great artwork as well, it's even better. But that's what I mean. It's I can't think of a time where I've felt that way about comic books. In modernity, where I've really felt like, wow, something's changing here. Maybe the last time was Warren Ellis's The Authority, which I thought was a really interesting take on superheroes. But again, it was being done by guys like Moore in the 80s. So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You have to go back quite a way to find something with that kind of power. Like The Authority. Yeah, it's an uncomfortable thought, really. And I think for me personally, which is one of the reasons I'm moving more and more towards text novels now, because I don't have to persuade anyone that I can just write what I like and publish what I like, and it seems to work. Mm-hmm. But I'm so aware that the majority of heroes in fiction, the big characters and so on, are all middle class or upper class. and very, very few of them are working class.
Yeah.
So, I think I've always tried to sort of reverse that, but without really thinking that much about it. It's just something I did. But now I do it in a very aware way. Defoe, for example, is a leveller, one of the British revolutionaries, and so there's a certain awareness that how far publishers are acting as the gatekeepers for the establishment and keeping these kind of stories out. And it goes back, it probably goes back as far as you like. It certainly goes back to the First World War, where there were the propaganda was very much geared to middle class heroes and everything. I mean, John Buchan, the 39 Steps author, was the spin doctor of World War One. And so you start to, after a while, to really get a sense that what's pumped into our heads is very Orwellian. So I think we all have a responsibility in our own different ways to try and do something about it and to try and change that. So I hope more people do.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, because I think right now we need a shake-up, but I think, as you've said, it needs to be in such a way as it feels authentic. It doesn't feel like some sort of fashion statement or someone trying to be cool with the kids, somebody who's trying to be in vogue or whatever. I think it needs to feel like, we're passionate about this. It's good storytelling. It draws the reader in, as opposed to bludgeoning you with the political talking points of the moment, just because that they know it'll move copies. And I feel like maybe that's a lot of, especially in the US market, that's a lot of what's going on. It's political talking points, or manifestations of Trump on paper that it's not interesting. It's not telling us anything. It's just what they think rammed home with no nuance, ham-fistedly. So
that does sound uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Well, the thing I would say to anyone who's who wants to get into comics is to consider self-publishing, to consider independence, and to also realise there's outlets like Comixology, which works for me. Now, you might say, well, it's Requiem, it's fantastic artwork, so of course it would work. But, that's part of the equation. If you're going to team up with an artist, it's got to be an artist who is really going to appeal to people. So that the whole self-publishing world is tremendously exciting. It's also very challenging and very difficult, but there, at least, I feel I have the freedom to say and do what I like, and
well,
there seems to be an audience for it, thankfully.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is that we were talking about it before we started the podcast, and that is that you now have the ability to communicate directly with your readership. I mean, you can write things online, or you can go through a publication, but now you have that ability to very directly talk to people, and it was never there before. And what an amazing tool, if used correctly,
Mark, I'm going to have to shoot in a sec, but it's great talking with you. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up with me?
Mate, I think, well, listen, we could talk all day, Pat, honestly. I could talk to you all day. But listen, if you've got places to be, I got to get ready for work. But it has been an absolute pleasure, and I hope we'll do this again sometime.
Definitely. Well, maybe another time we can talk about self-publishing, and if anyone wants to know some of the ins and outs of it, I'll be very happy to, give them some pointers, because it's just like anything that's new. It always seems like a jungle, but there are ways through that jungle. And it is possible for people to be successful and to make a living at it. And so, yeah, I'd really like to encourage people in that direction.
Well, listen.
Yeah, great talking with you, Mark.
Great talking with you too, mate. Listen, you enjoy the rest of your day, and take it easy. And like I say, we'll get in contact, and we'll do this again sometime.
All right, then. Bye for now.
Take care, mate. Bye.
Bye.
And there you go, folks. That was Pat Mills. I would love to hear from you in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. So please leave me some feedback and let me know what you thought of what Pat and I had to talk about. As always, you can I'll have my little addendum at the very end, and you know I can tell you where you can go and check out my stuff, and I'll have links to Pat's in the description. So take care, guys. Look forward to seeing you next week in Considering Comic Books. Bye. Thanks for watching the video, and if you enjoyed it, please comment below. I'd love to hear from you. You can follow me at Consider Comics on Twitter. That's Consider_comics, and you can check out my own work with my artistic collaborator, very talented Ryan Brown, over at his website, ryanbrownart.com, where the first part of our free online webcomic, Esther the Relique, is available for free. Please enjoy, and if you like it or hate it, and you've got any criticism or feedback, we would love to hear from you.